There's an old phrase that says no good act goes unpunished. And of course, it's not a true statement. It's an exaggeration that makes a point. And so the meaning of the phrase is that sometimes we have the best of intentions in doing something for someone, but the good deed is not received well. So let's imagine. Imagine that a friend of yours was experiencing an extended illness. And so to be nice, you decided, I'm going to do something nice for her. I'm going to provide her a nice meal. And so you bake one of your favorites, a black bean enchilada casserole. And you head to her house. And when she answers the door, you express how sorry you are that she's not feeling well. And you say, I know that right now you don't feel like cooking, so I've made you one of my favorites, black bean enchilada casserole. And she eyes the casserole and answers, I really don't like black beans. So you do something nice, but it's not received well. And it happens to everyone. It happened in a big way to Paul. He was anxious to get back to Jerusalem, and one of the reasons is that he had a large love offering to deliver to the church. This love offering had been collected by the Gentile churches. So obviously, when he arrived, he presented the church with the gift. But instead of a report on how the gift was received, Luke writes about the distrust and borderline hatred that some in the church have for Paul. His intentions were good, but Paul was not well received. We see the story in Acts 21. When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God. So Paul receives a warm welcome in Jerusalem, and so far, everything was looking good. After a long and dangerous journey, Paul's friends were happy to see him safe and sound. There would be smiles and laughter and hugs and kisses as the brothers and sisters welcomed Paul back to the Jerusalem church. They no doubt shared a meal together that evening as they exchanged stories and pleasantries. It was just good to be together again. And Paul would give a report on his journey. He meets the next morning with James and the elders of the church. And James is the brother of Jesus. He has become the leader of the church at this time. It's kind of interesting that none of the apostles are mentioned. Evidently, they were not in Jerusalem at the time. They were probably traveling and ministering in other areas. But Paul gives a detailed report to the elders about his third missionary journey. And his report would have included all the churches he visited, the struggles he faced, the issues in the church at Corinth, and the successful ministry he had in Ephesus. And the elders were happy about the way God was using Paul to reach the Gentile world for Christ. They had earlier endorsed Paul's ministry to the Gentiles during the Jerusalem conference, and so they were happy to hear of his successes. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. So do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them about our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality." The next day, Paul took them in and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them. So the elders share a concern with Paul. The mood in the room changed quickly. The church leaders were happy to see Paul, but not everyone at the church was. You see, just as Paul had success with the Gentiles as he led them to Christ, the believers in Jerusalem experienced success too, leading thousands of Jews to Christ. However, some of these new converts were zealous for the law. In other words, they had accepted Christ as their Messiah, but they still carefully followed the Mosaic law and Jewish traditions. Actually, this is an issue that had been settled earlier at the Jerusalem conference. At the conference, it was decided that the Jewish Christians would remain faithful to the Jewish law, but Gentile converts would not be subject to the law, except for a few things that would have been especially offensive to the Jews, such as eating food sacrificed to idols and sexual immorality. But these new converts were zealous for the law. Instead of the balanced approach that the Jerusalem conference allowed, the new Jewish believers sided heavily on the belief that all Christians, Jews and Gentiles, should embrace Mosaic law and Jewish traditions. And since there were thousands of them, their voice was heard. They had strength in numbers. So what was behind this zealousness? Well, Paul probably arrived in Jerusalem in the spring of AD 56 or 57, and this was during the time that Felix was the Roman governor of Judea. The Jewish historian Josephus describes this period of the mid-50s as a time of intense Jewish nationalism and political unrest. There were several Jewish rebellions against Roman rule, and Felix brutally suppressed them all. And the way that Felix responded to the Jews increased the Jewish hatred for Rome and caused anti-Gentile feelings. It was a time when pro-Jewish feelings were at its height. Anyone who was friendly with outsiders was viewed suspiciously. But then some took their anti-Gentile feelings much further. In the temple, there were people called Sicarii, and they were basically terrorists. They murdered aristocrats suspected of collaborating with the Gentiles, plunging their knives into their hearts. Jewish hatred for Rome was at a peak. In fact, a war was soon to come in which Rome would destroy Jerusalem. Mixed with hatred toward Rome was often a mistrust or hatred of all Gentiles. Considering all that, Paul's mission to the Gentiles would not have been well received. The Jerusalem elders were in somewhat of a bind. On one hand, they had supported Paul's witness to the Gentiles at the Jerusalem conference. But now, they found Paul was not really welcomed by the new converts in Jerusalem, whose numbers were in the thousands. They didn't appreciate his mission to the Gentiles because they didn't like the Gentiles. So Paul was unwelcome in Jerusalem. First, by the non-Christian Jews who considered him an enemy, but also by the members of the Church of Jerusalem, particularly the new converts. So, the elders had to come up with a plan to put Paul in good standing with the Jewish Christians who loved the law but not the Gentiles. And they certainly didn't want to discount Paul's successes with the Gentiles, but they also didn't want to lose the new Jewish converts in Jerusalem. The Jewish Christians were especially upset with Paul over a rumor that started. Word was being spread around that Paul encouraged Jewish Christians to stop practicing the requirements of Jewish law, such as circumcision. Well, as Paul traveled around the various Gentile lands, he would also encounter Jews. In fact, his strategy was to always go to the synagogues first as he entered a new city and tell the Jews about Jesus. The Jews that he encountered had been scattered by persecution in Jerusalem. And the irony is that Paul was once one of the major persecutors of Christians, and so he caused a good deal of the scattering. These scattered Jews were called diaspora Jews. And diaspora means that these Jews had been forced to move or disperse from their homelands in Israel to various other lands. So some of these diaspora Jews who had become Christians began saying that Paul disregards Jewish law and encourages Jewish Christians to do the same. These are almost the same things that they said about Jesus and Stephen. He was teaching the Jews to forsake the laws and customs given by Moses and the fathers. Jewish law, and particularly the practice of circumcision, were the things that made Jews distinct from other people. It gave them their identity. So in the minds of the law-loving Jewish Christians, Paul had overstepped. He was robbing the Jews of who they were as people of God. Well, in reality, Paul never did what they said he did. Paul was a Jewish Christian. He was circumcised. And for fellow Jews who became Christians, it was okay with him that they continued with Jewish traditions as long as they understood that it was not the law nor circumcision that saved them. Paul is even the one who encouraged Timothy to be circumcised. And as far as Jewish traditions, we recall that Paul had taken a Jewish vow while in Corinth. So obviously, he had not completely abandoned his Jewish ways. However, with Gentiles, he did make it clear that Jewish law and traditions and circumcision were not required for salvation. It was not the law that saved them, and circumcision was not a sign of salvation. So what probably happened is that some Jewish people heard Paul speak or preach to a Gentile audience that Christ alone brings salvation, and that obeying the law or becoming circumcised have nothing to do with being saved. It is by grace we are saved. The Jews who heard those words either misunderstood their meaning or they deliberately twisted them around. So, the next thing you know, a rumor is running wild that Paul wants everyone to abandon Jewish law and traditions. So the elders' solution was that Paul must prove that he still supports Jewish traditions. So Paul was to pay for the expenses of 4 men who were participating in the Nazirite vow and show that he supported their ritual. The reason a person would take a vow like this was to dedicate himself to the Lord for a period of time. And during this time, the Nazirite didn't drink wine, avoided any contact with a corpse, and left his hair uncut. Well, the 4 men were ending their vow soon. And when it ended, their hair would be cut and burned as an offering in the temple. Besides cutting and burning their hair, the men had to offer several additional sacrifices: a male and female lamb, a ram, and cereal and drink offerings. And this would add up to a substantial sum of money. So Paul would pay for all of it to show that he supported their very Jewish endeavors. Paul also showed his support by joining in their vow, probably by undergoing a purification ritual. Jews who have returned from traveling in Gentile territory would engage in a ritual purification. And such a purification required 7 days, which fits into the time period left for the 4 men ending their vow. And James then reminded everyone in the room that this had nothing to do with Paul's ministry to the Gentiles or the requirements for their salvation. He emphasized that the items that were agreed upon at the Jerusalem conference were still agreed upon, that Gentiles refrained from dietary practices and immoral behavior that would upset Jewish believers. So we see that Paul agreed to go along with James' plan to appease the Jewish believers who were zealous for the law. It's interesting that Paul, who had come to Jerusalem to deliver a generous offering from the Gentile churches, was asked to give up some of his hard-earned money to satisfy a group that distrusted the Gentiles. But Paul was gracious. He could have pitched a fit, saying, "Are you guys crazy? Don't you see all this money that's been collected by the Gentile churches for you? Isn't that enough to prove the Gentiles' love and support for the Jewish believers in Jerusalem?" But Paul didn't make that speech. Instead, he agreed to go along with the leader's plan to prove he was still Jewish enough. Paul's willingness to support the Nazarites and to undertake the purification rites himself illustrates his principle of becoming all things to all men for the sake of the gospel. So the takeaway in today's message is that we must learn to practice grace. When you think about it, Paul really got stuck with a bad deal. First, we know that he was completely within God's will. He traveled the world and risked his life to take the gospel to the Gentiles. Second, we know he was a Jewish Christian, and yet some Jewish Christians in Jerusalem had become his enemy. And third, the entire episode was based upon rumors, not truth. And fourth, Paul came to Jerusalem in good faith to bring a love offering to the church, and yet he was viewed with suspicion. Paul shouldn't have to prove anything to anybody. His track record spoke for itself. And yet, that was exactly the situation he found himself in. He had to prove that he was Jewish enough to satisfy his critics. Well, as unfair as it was, he agreed to do it. He did it willingly and without a fight. He did it for the unity of the church. He did it because he loved those who apparently had declared themselves his enemy. He did it so that Christ's kingdom and message could go forward. There are times when we may be faced with a confrontational situation, and maybe completely in the right and wrongly accused and even attacked. But we don't have to go to war every time that happens. There are times we need to turn the other cheek. There are times we need to bite our tongue. There are times we need to just let it go for the sake of getting along. And it's true whenever people get together. Churches, committees, marriages, sports teams, clubs, at work, and on and on. Paul chose the path of unity. And in so doing, Paul acted in grace.